All right, guys, let's go ahead and get started. Let's talk about chapter 15, the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is essentially a system of motor neurons, preganglionic and postganglionic neurons that are sent from your brain and your spinal cord to handle kind of the day-to-day maintenance things of your body. Right, so your autonomic nervous system innervates a lot of your smooth muscles. So that's the muscles like of your stomach, intestines, digestive system, etc. Your cardiac muscle, obviously, and then your glands, like your sweat glands, your salivary glands, and all of the other glands in your brain that do your day-to-day things, hormone running, all of that jazz. Okay. So your autonomic nervous system regulates things like your heart rate, your blood pressure, your digestion, via these two kind of divisions called the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Okay. So the autonomic nervous system is that general visceral. You have that visceral and you have the somatic divisions of the overall nervous system. Okay. And that looks like this. It's better drawn on this, right? You have your when you break up the peripheral nervous system, we have the sensory and the motor divisions. And that motor division gets broken into somatic and autonomic, and then that autonomic gets broken into sympathetic and parasympathetic. Okay? We are focusing here. We've already talked about all the other things. Okay? Cool. So, these next couple slides are going to compare how the autonomic and the somatic motor systems work. In the somatic motor system, like we've talked about in earlier chapters, you get one motor neuron from the central nervous system that goes to a skeletal muscle. So say you'll get your brain. Sure, this is a brain. Great. And your spinal cord, all your spinal nerves. You will get your one motor neuron from the CNS. Let's say it's this one, sure. That connects from the CNS to the, I wish I had not done that in red, but to the muscle itself. This is a muscle, don't judge my journey. Thank you. So you have that one neuron that synapses directly to that muscle, and that forms that, gosh, I'm choosing awful colors, neuromuscular junction. Okay. These axons are super well myelinated. They have to be because they need to move quickly in order for your muscles to move fast enough to do what you need them to do. Okay. So you have some super well myelinated, rapidly conducting nerve impulses going from the central nervous system. That can either be the brain, could be the spinal cord, could be anything that is the central nervous system, directly to the skeletal muscle. Okay. So that's the somatic or voluntary motor systems. In the autonomic nervous system, there is a different kind of breakdown of how this process of one neuron getting from brain to effector organ, it looks a little bit different in the autonomic nervous system. Okay. In the somatic motor system, you have one neuron that does all the work. And in the autonomic, you have two neurons that share work. Okay. Those neurons are called the preganglionic and the postganglionic neuron. This is important. Okay. The preganglionic neuron is the first neuron before it hits what we will call a ganglia. And then the second neuron is obviously the postganglionic neuron. That's a ganglia. This one is pre, this one is post. Okay. Autonomic nervous system conduction is a little bit slower than in the somatic nervous system because those axons are usually a little bit thinner or not as heavily myelinated, but they do still work relatively quickly, okay? And a motor neurons synapse in a ganglion, and we'll talk about what that means. That's this, the ganglion, okay? And so the preganglionic and the postganglionic are both motor neurons. Let's keep that clear. So this image is kind of just depicting what I have just said. This side here being the somatic motor innervation. You have one nerve that goes from the central nervous system all the way to the effector muscle that it needs to work. And then in the autonomic, you have this preganglionic, postganglionic kind of existence going on here. I'm trying to outline that a little bit better. Preganglionic and postganglionic existence. And you have that division both in the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So remember, we're in the oops, that's ugly green. As we are in the autonomic nervous system, we have the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions, and they both do this two motor neuron preganglia postganglia thing. Okay, the thing with the autonomic nervous system is that a lot of the time both the parasympathetic and sympathetic innervations will be on the same structure, right? So if you have your heart here, your heart, that's the ugliest heart I've ever drawn. Okay, so you have your heart, you have some fibers that are sympathetic and are causing like an increase of heart rate, increase of blood pressure, all that jazz, okay? And then you have your parasympathetic fibers also on that same organ that tell your heart, okay, you can slow down. You don't need to be so fast anymore. Decreasing blood pressure, all that stuff, okay? And they cause opposite, opposing effects. Very much how like a muscle cannot undo the action of its own work. Your nervous system cannot, your sympathetic nervous system cannot tell your body to calm down after it has raised it all up. That is the job of the parasympathetic nervous system, okay? So your sympathetic nervous system shoots off and gets crazy when you are stressed. So that is your fight or flight. Your fight or flight causes things like I said, increased heart rate, blood pressure, vasodilation to skeletal muscles, vasoconstriction to like your intestines, digesting muscles, all that stuff. So that's your sympathetic fight or flight. And I'm going to try to keep these colors consistent from here on out. And then the parasympathetic division controls kind of routine maintenance. We like to call this one rest and digest. So this is the system that will decrease your heart rate, decrease your blood pressure, do some vasoconstriction to the skeletal muscles, and vasodilation to the stomach and organ systems. Okay. Like I said, sympathetic, fight or flight. It's activated during extreme situations. Extreme is not even necessarily true, just any kind of body stress. Where like your body feels like it's in danger. All right. Some of the things that your sympathetic nervous system does, like I said, increases heart rate, increases breathing rate. These are lungs, okay? Just go with it. Increases blood and oxygen to skeletal muscles so that you can run faster, run farther, with less fatigue. And it constricts blood vessels in everywhere else, because when you're running, you don't need to be worrying about if you're gonna poop in the next 10 minutes. You don't even know if you're gonna be alive in the next 10 minutes, so you need to just keep running, right? Helps to dilate your pupils and your bronchioles. This helps you see far and breathe good. Okay? And then it inhibits some of your digesting urinary tracts, because like I said, you don't need these if you're going to be dead in the next 10 minutes. If you're running for your life, you don't need to worry about poop. Okay? The parasympathetic division is activates when your body is no longer in danger, when the threat has passed, when you are no longer running for the hills, and your body can come back to kind of homeostasis. So you can think of the parasympathetic division as to come back to baseline. Okay. Its main job is to conserve energy, and it does a lot of the housekeeping activities like digestion, peeing, pooping, resting, all of that stuff, okay? So pretty much everything that the sympathetic nervous system does, the parasympathetic nervous system does the opposite. So it decreases heart rate, blood pressure, decreases respiration to low or normal levels, right? So this is just kind of an overview of that division breakdown. Let's go sympathetic on that one. Okay. So in the sympathetic nervous system, you'll see your preganglionic neuron. Oops, sorry. Your preganglionic neuron starts doing its thing. Right over here at this ganglion, it will synapse and then become a postganglionic neuron and start affecting things in your organ systems over here. Same thing with the parasympathetic. It's just the preganglionics. On the parasympathetic side, the preganglionics are long and the postganglionics are short. Whereas on the sympathetic side, the preganglionic are short and the postganglionic is long. All right. So the sympathetic nervous system is also called the thoracolumbar division. That's because its nerve fibers generate from T1 to L4 or L5, L4 or 5, I think. Okay. And the parasympathetic division, its nerve fibers originate from your brainstem and the sacral plexus. The nerves that we know of from the brainstem, those are your cranial nerves. We've talked about your cranial nerves. There are some cranial nerves that are mostly parasympathetic in nature, some that are mostly sympathetic in nature, and we'll talk about that when we get there. Okay? So like I said kind of a little bit earlier, in the sympathetic nervous system, you have short preganglionic neurons, and you have long postganglionic fibers. And in the parasympathetic nervous system, you have short postganglionic neurons and long preganglionic neurons. Okay? The sympathetic fibers tend to branch quite a bit. So one neuron, one at least postganglionic neuron, could affect several different organs, like your heart, your lungs, your eyes, your vessels. Okay? And then the parasympathetic fibers very rarely branch. You'll find that most of the time those postganglionic parasympathetic fibers are going to be right inside the organ that they are trying to synapse on. And I'll draw that better when we get there, okay? This is a kidney. We're going to say that this is the ganglion, and the parasympathetic postganglionic fiber is right there in there, okay? So they're pretty localized in what they do. All right? Okay. And then in the neurotransmitters that these neurons release, by the postganglionic neurons at least, because the preganglionic neurons of both your sympathetic and your parasympathetic, they both release acetylcholine. Okay? In the sympathetic nervous system, the postganglionic neurons release norepinephrine, and in the parasympathetic, they release acetylcholine. And based on what type of neurotransmitter they release is what we determine them to be adrenergic or cholinergic. Adrenergic just means that they release norepinephrine and epinephrine. And cholinergic just means it releases acetylcholine. All right? Not too bad. All right, this table is just kind of going through some of the differences between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. We know that sympathetic has that thoracolumbar, and I was wrong, it was L2, I'm sorry. And then has its ganglia close to the central nervous system, short preganglionics, long postganglionics. We'll talk about splanchnic nerves. Those are the exception. There's, like I said, it's biology. There's an exception to every rule. Okay? Lots of branching, lots of acetylcholine. In the preganglionic fibers, and lots of norepinephrine in the postganglionic fibers. And then in the parasympathetic, we have that craniosacral outflow, so from the brainstem and the sacrum. Its ganglia are in or on those organs, the effector organs. Long pregang, short postgang, and lots of acetylcholine. Okay? So let's kind of talk about that craniosacral outflow. This is just referring to kind of how those nerves are leaving the central nervous system, okay? So the cranial part, obviously, those originate from the brain. These are cranial nerves. There are some specific cranial nerves that we'll get into in just a little bit there. But usually those nerves will innervate the head, the neck, the thorax, and the abdomen because they're relatively close, okay? And then the sacrum, remember these are S2 through S4 spinal nerves, and they innervate kind of the far portions of the digestive tract and the pelvic organs in a parasympathetic way. So remember that that's the rest and digest kind of way. All right. I'm not going to make you memorize all of these specific ganglion, but know that these get, let's back up a little bit because I think that gets a little bit confusing, right? So I was talking about those pre and post ganglionic neurons. In this case with the parasympathetic nervous system, I'm going to draw it blue there. So we see that our nerve, this one in this case is cranial nerve 3. The preganglionic neuron originates in the brainstem. That nerve then travels all the way to that ciliary ganglion. Ganglion, just remember it, or a ganglia. Let's put a definition on there. Ganglia is location of cell bodies. All right, so that preganglionic neuron travels to that ganglia, synapses with the postganglionic fiber. I'm going to make that green. That postganglionic fiber will then go to the effector organ. In this case, it's the eye. All right. So that's kind of how that ganglia breakdown works, right? You get from your originating place to the ganglia that you're supposed to be in, and then you go off to the effector organ. And this is just showing you some specific ganglia. The ciliary ganglion, the pterygopalatine ganglion, the submandibular ganglion, and the otic ganglion. And there are some other kind of plexuses. Plexus is just kind of like a group of nerves that go to the heart, the lungs, liver, etc. In the sacral region, you have some of these other nerves that are going to the genitals, the bladder, some sacral roots going to the rectum, distal parts of the intestine. We kind of talked about those as well. Okay? In the parasympathetic nervous system, on the cranial outflow side, some of the preganglionic neurons, like I said, run through some of the cranial nerves. Those cranial nerves would be 3, oculomotor, 7, facial, 9, glossopharyngeal, and 10, the vagus nerve. All right. The cell bodies of those preganglionic neurons are in the motor cranial nerve nuclei in gray matter of the brainstem. All right. So those hang out in the brainstem. I'm not going to draw a brainstem. It's ugly. Okay. And then they kind of go on through. And so the next few slides are just kind of going to go through how those specific nerves, the oculomotor, the facial, the glossopharyngeal, the vagus, where those nerve fibers pass through. All right. So the oculomotor cranial nerve 3, its parasympathetic fibers innervate smooth muscles of the eye and cause pupil constriction. So that's when you are not running away. You just need to see up close. The preganglionic cell bodies are in the oculomotor nucleus of the midbrain. And then the postganglionic cell bodies are in that ciliary ganglion. All right. So if we're going from the brain, imagine that I've drawn a brain and a brainstem better than that. Great. Go from the brain, we take that cranial nerve 3, that preganglionic neuron. Remember, this is the ocular motor nucleus. Okay. That preganglionic neuron will pass through and go all the way to, boom, that ciliary ganglion. Okay? And it's gonna drop off in there. That ciliary ganglion is where the cell body of the postganglionic neuron arises. So they will do their little synapse, they'll send their little information for the record that is acetylcholine being released. Postganglionic neuron will take that, and run its fibers to the target organs, which is technically not the eye, but the smooth muscle behind the eye that makes your pupils tiny. Okay? Make sense? Great. Okay? So the facial nerve is cranial nerve 7. The parasympathetic fibers stimulate secretion of glands in the head. So very similar to the ocular motor nerve. Its nucleus, it has a couple of different nuclei, but the lacrimal nucleus in the pons then synapses to that pterygopalatine ganglion, and then goes to the tear ducts. Okay. The superior salivatory nucleus is what helps you create saliva. Lacrimal nucleus helps you create tears. Okay. So these parasympathetic fibers stimulate the secretion of glands, mostly in the head. The glossopharyngeal nerve, its parasympathetic fibers stimulate secretion of more glands in the head. They start in the inferior salivatory nucleus in the medulla oblongata. We kind of talked about that a little bit when we talked about the medulla oblongata. And its fibers tend to innervate just a couple of more like salivary glands in the head and neck. All right, so most important of all is the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, does a lot of work. It is the longest cranial nerve, goes all the way from your brainstem, and it has some innervations clear down to like your abdomen. Okay, so its fibers innervate visceral organs. Visceral organs are like your stomach, your digestive tract, etc. And parasympathetically, also your heart as well. Parasympathetically, your vagus nerve, when stimulated, reduces the heart rate, stimulates digestion, reduces blood pressure, all of that jazz in a parasympathetic fashion. When it's working, it's parasympathetic magic. It encourages digestion, reduces heart rate, blood pressure, all that jazz. Its preganglionic cell bodies are in the dorsal motor nucleus of the medulla oblongata, and its postganglionic neurons are usually their cell bodies are usually within the walls of the organs, so they are clear out to the target organ. All right. So let me draw my little brain again. Okay. So that cranial nerve 10 goes from that medulla, and remember these have long preganglionic fibers. And then within the wall of that organ are where these cell bodies of the postganglionic neurons would arise. All right. So that's kind of what we're talking about there. All right. So the vagus nerve sends branches, like I said, kind of all over the place. You got some going through your cardiac plexus, your pulmonary plexus, your esophageal plexus, your celiac plexus, and your superior mesenteric plexus. This is intestine. This is stomach, liver, organs there. Okay. This kind of just is an image showing kind of the different branches of the vagus nerve and all of the places that it goes. Vagus nerve is a big one. All right. That's the end of that one.